Our main focus and goal here is Cumberland Plain grassy woodland restoration. We've been lucky enough to get some funding through Caring for Country, and then we've also had great support from OEH, Western Sydney Parkland and Greater Sydney Local Land Services. So we've been able to sort of pull together some various partners. We're looking to use direct seeding techniques to try and put these sort of ground layer communities back at slightly larger scales. So it doesn't preclude approaches like regeneration. It doesn't preclude good management and trying to work with resilience in your landscapes. Pretty much anywhere you go in southeastern Australia, including these gorgeous things like the Blue Mountains and stuff like that, pretty much everywhere else has been highly modified. And in those landscapes, there's frighteningly little left. We're trying to sort of reconstruct communities in highly fragmented landscapes where access to plants, certainly access to seed, is highly limited. You're often dealing with issues around inbreeding, depression. Seed is obviously the critical component, and there is so little of it left. If we were to rely just on the remnants, they would be destroyed in no time at all. And in fact, there just wouldn't be enough seed. What we've done here is to spend 3 years, probably getting on towards 4 years, working our way across this landscape, collect small amounts of seed from wild populations, so you're not overtaxing them, trying to get as good a genetic representation as you can, but often those populations in themselves are terrifyingly small. So then what we have to do more often than not is to combine populations. Just working within 5 kilometres, you would just never find enough to sensibly put back large components of the community. So it's part pragmatism, and it is partly, I think, based on a slightly new awareness of the genetic issues. And I'd also add as well that our response now to climate change issues and the projections of changes in local areas has a lot of people already now anyway, and many of them I think were at the time quite strong exponents of the local provenance argument, are now opening their minds to mixing things from distances away where we're projecting things, are going to change. So we're much more open to the idea. Because we're working with often small and fragmented and inbred populations, it can take 2 or 3 years to get enough plants to get into these beds. It's frighteningly slow in many of these instances. And often it takes several years to get enough populations where we're getting a better gene flow that it seems to produce better offspring. When you're working with government projects, you've got a strict timeline, and these sort of ecological or realistic situations really don't play much of a part for them. But we have no option but to deal with them. So there is some irony in that this seed production area here won't be fully productive until probably after our project's finished. By a few years. Now for me that's not an issue at all, because what we're really hoping here is to say, well, here's an asset for the region which is able to produce seed for restoration purposes into the future. And I think it's a great outcome from that point of view. But from a clear reporting point of view to a funding agency, to them that it strikes them as quite sort of odd. We grow them as crops. They look nice and they're sort of pretty, but to us they're just crops. They've got to produce seed. Then we take that seed into the landscape again, and then they're back to being a community that will evolve and generate and ebb and flow as it will. So here we irrigate. It's recycled water, and so there is a fair bit of nutrient in that. So in a sense we're fertilising them. We will control for pests. It looks really lo-fi, and it is in some sense lo-fi, but it breaks my heart that to some degree the sort of work that we're doing here and the sort of work that Tim and others are doing is the state of the art at the moment in our country for this sort of thing. And yet if I was to grow tomatoes or brassicas or something for Coles or Woolworths, I'd be able to go to a bank and probably get $5 million and build a fantastic structure with computerised equipment and fantastic irrigation facilities. But because there's not a market in this, We're forced to do it in this sort of really lo-fi way. We will spend vast amounts of money to do very similar things for something that's going into a shop. But because there's no endpoint for the environment, for what we do, it's very much undervalued. Sadly, our sector is, very poorly paid, and it's, the work tenure is very insecure and all those sorts of things, and it's no different for us. So I guess at the end of this, what we're hoping is that, yes, we can possibly get some more public funding which will augment what we're doing, but ultimately I'm really keen to show if this can be done in the larger landscape, if we can start returning the roadsides of Sydney, the M2 and the Great Western, instead of those being full of lovegrass or bromus or ryegrass, why the hell aren't we sowing down Themata? Why can't we have swathes of wildflowers in our public reserves in Blacktown and Penrith? It is doable. It's just up until now we've never had the resource, and in many cases a lot of the people in bureaucracy don't believe it can be done. So what I'm hoping here is that if people like us and as you've done can demonstrate sites, and we can take people from councils or local government, and we've got people like that interested now, and say here's what's possible. At least now there's an alternative, and maybe a market will start to develop. Well, ultimately we have to, like most businesses, account for all the costs that go into this and then hope like crazy that then can work into a situation that's still affordable for a client, whether it's a government client or a private client. But because everyone, we're just so market driven in this society, it's got to produce, a profit. And in many instances, what we do probably never will.
We're now, I suppose, after 4 years of working this project, we are now starting to be able to develop those numbers. Our seed production area will probably be at full capacity at the end of this project. So, in the first few years, you're spending a lot of time going out into the landscapes, collecting, using a lot of labour, and you're not getting much yield. You're trying to propagate, you're spending a lot of money in the nursery. Eventually, you've got to spend a bit more money to plant them out, and then eventually, maybe a year after that, you start getting the seed yield. So there is that lag that Paul was talking about. So I think the reality of is the startup is very expensive, but eventually you start catching up. So we'll get a much greater economy of scale this year in terms of our labour cost relative to our yield. So yeah, I think the numbers now are starting to probably look in the right sort of trajectory, but probably those first few years it does look a bit grim when you're trying to sell that story. So we've got about 100 species here now. And they've all sort of come in progressively over time. We started off with the species that were sort of most easy to find in the landscape, and now we're getting to some really interesting, rare and even some extinct species that are localised, so that's been quite exciting. I think from a personal level for our staff, learning about these production systems, so as Paul said, it does look fairly lo-fi, but Kieran and Jane will certainly be able to point out to you as we go how much we've developed in our barrier construction, to where we put plants, how we propagate, how we collect seeds. So there's been a lot of learning involved. It's not just a matter of maintaining this production area, but getting new species, getting more genetic material. That's been an ongoing concern. We started off some of this seed production in little foam boxes because we could only get tiny amounts of seed. So we went out and got those tiny amounts of seed, planted them, collected off those boxes, and eventually built up enough seed resourcing to be able to plant out into the in-ground system. So that's been quite interesting. So last year we collected 317 kilos from this facility, which is pretty good, and again, it's just a start-up phase, so we're quite pleased with that. And in terms of breaking that down, we collected 45 kilos of herb seed from here, and we collected 200 grams from remnants. So you can see in terms of availability, what that's doing to enable us to generate this complex work. And it's also taking pressure off those remnants. And in terms of our grasses, again, the grasses are quite young, so we're not seeing full yields yet, but we collected 250 kilos of grass seed from the seed production area, and we collected 20 from the wild. So a 10-fold difference there.
One of the issues we did have with seed viability, an interesting one, is herbaceae. They're widespread, they grow from heathlands to forests in all kinds of forms, shrubs, vines, and so on, subshrubs. Well, we have herbaceae here which is not producing seed at all, not ascaric, but it's flowering profusely, absolutely madly. And we figured from observation that probably it needs, and from a little bit of knowledge, researching it, that it probably needs pollinator, a specialised pollinator. And Herbaceae is a highly specialised family that needs buzz pollination, and that involves native bees. So in an effort to attract more native bees to the site, we've started to build a bee hotel up there. We might pass it. It's actually just a pile of rubble at the moment, but we're sort of gradually, building something out of it. But the good news is the other day we were out there and we saw a blue-banded bee in the Herbaceae cell. We've got two styles of structure. We've got the mounds, which you see in front of you. They allow collection, they allow the plant to spread easily, they allow us to manoeuvre ourselves between the plants and collect seed. And then further on we have what we call flatbeds.
The trellis ones, which would link into what you've got
in there.
Yeah.
Jane and I did some quick seed collection because we had 5 minutes to spare. And in that 5 minutes we collected that much Canedia seed. And I'd challenge you to find that much in the wild in 5 days, let alone 5 minutes.
We try to get a minimum of 50 plants per, we call these things cells. So in terms of that sort of collection and genetic type literature, it normally says that your base population, if you can get, should be 50 individuals. So we try and base everything on 50, but most, these sort of cells are around 350 to 400. In many instances, there's several thousand. So in terms of a genetic sort of mixing, we try and create as much possibility as we can. We don't know all their breeding syndromes, but I think a lot of these are outbreeding. Some of the grasses obviously mix in, self-pollination and crossing, but we do try and take that into account. These two cells where Jane and I are, this is a little native flax, Alinum marginale. So a lot of these things you've got to really manage their productivity. So some of them you can reinvigorate them by cutting them back and you get a massive new growth. But some of them we think only really have a productive life of say 2 seasons, some of them even 1 season, and we will replant them. You can see the Thyssinotis over behind us here. That's just really pretty. And I think a whole lot of these plants also have amenity value. So what we're hoping over time as well is to start bringing in landscape architects and people like that who are working in housing developments and saying, okay, have a look at this as a potential plant in your developments, and we also have the resource to actually provide that. So it's a multi-pronged approach, but that little patch of Thyssinotis there, again, that's taken 4 years to get that to that point. We still go back out into the wild and collect small amounts of seed so that when we're repropagating, we've still got new genetic material to bring into these crops. It always struck me as odd when I first came to Sydney in these grassy woodlands, or what were thought to be in some instances, the lack of daisies. And I thought, oh, that's odd because they're in every other grassy woodland I go to in the southeast. But then I would find these tiny populations and I think, oh, okay, well, they're sort of here. But I think it has a lot to do with the tree regrowth that we have now in this region. I mean, the bush block over there, we've got, sort of stem counts up to around 2,000 stems of, sort of the grey box per hectare. I've looked at the early transcript of Governor Phillip when he first came out here, and he was standing on Richmond Hill, which is possibly a couple of kilometres that way, and he made the observation that the countryside was full of large trees, widely spaced with little undergrowth. So what we have now in many instances is nothing like the original composition. And a lot of these daisies that need a lot of light have suffered quite badly. So the other day I found a tiny little patch of podolepis, a showy podolepis in a site. And the only place I found it in a little remnant was around the edges where it had access to some light. Do you put them back like we've got them now because that's what they are, or do you try to go for some historic sort of composition? But those compositions were only like that because they were managed in that way by the Aboriginal people. So unless we're prepared to manage them that way, they won't stay like that. And it would seem that the way that we're prepared to manage bushland in this region is in a way that creates a bazillion stems and possibly a Basaria thicket in the middle or a lovegrass canopy underneath. We've got a lot of contact with people like Jonathan Sanders in national parks, and one of the great frustrations is that these large areas that we're trying to reserve Cumberland Plain fauna has a handful of staff or relies on getting in, you guys to tender for jobs at the absolute lowest price and just doing the minimum you can. That's not going to create the community of the past that we read about. So these flatbeds and the trellis are the two other formats that we use. So we tend to put either grasses or flaxes in these sort of things, or some of the daisies or Wahlenbergeria type things that we can just come through and whippersnip off. So the collection of the seed here is one of the big things that we're trying to streamline. So we'll use combinations of just sweeping in some of those rows. We've also got vacuum harvesters that we just go back and we've got bags for every species so that we can keep them separate and we can collect them that way. We've got brush harvesters, so different species take different approaches, but these sort of open ones allow us to sort of grow things with a bit more light. These things have evolved in landscapes where either fire was fairly frequent and so that regenerated the vegetation, or kangaroos and herbivores were constantly grazing them. And I've seen more grasslands go backwards and really lose quality because they haven't been managed in a sense that their vegetation has been either eaten or burnt, and they become rank and they tend to lose their vigour. So it's really important, not only in a production sense, but in the landscape, that we're able to manage in a way that keeps these things active and growing and producing flowers and producing seed. So we get masses more seed growing them in this vertical plane. Often we just let it drop because it all pops, and then so we just sweep it up. It's almost impossible to get the seed of some of these things in the wild because they just disappear. Whereas with the weed mat, at least you can sweep that up and process it. This little lotus patch here, that population is now extinct. It's been bulldozed. Rhodanthe very, very, very much reduced. The Botanic Gardens had a small collection of seed. They'd put some seed into their new plant bank landscaping. But Peter said to us, if you would like to put this into production, you're able to have some seed. And now for the first time, hopefully this will be a component that we can put back into the landscape. It's a really pretty little thing. It's gorgeous. Down at Mount Anna, it's one of the sort of real showy little things. Things like hedgehog grass in here, again, not a key species, but great to have in landscapes. We've got a little few patches of Themata over there, and for the last 2 years, they represent the biggest single pure stands of Themata that we can find anywhere on the Cumberland Plain. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a few stands of Themata on the Cumberland Plain, but most of those, when you get to them, are either inaccessible or mowed. Even something which would have been just all over the place in this landscape is almost impossible to find at the scale that you need to collect it, to take it back into the landscape.
Ostrastypha ramosissima. It's a really attractive plant, grows quite big and tall. I think it's got a lot of potential for landscape architect sort of applications. We've actually done calculations based on per plant, and this echinopogon actually yields more grass seed than any other of our grass species. Our scenario is a little bit different, say, to Botanic Gardens. So they're a sort of a long-term storage, whereas we're a restoration seed bank, so we're looking to use our seed within 12 months.
Here you can see our grass swards. This is not the ideal way to do this. Normally it would be just in a paddock and you would grow them on scale. But again, because we're starting from such a low base here in Sydney, we've had to move, most of this started in boxes because that's the amount of seed that we could get and plants we could propagate, little foam boxes. And then we moved those into the landscape. We tried originally just to seed this, didn't work, there was too much weed load here. So then we grew plants just in bare ground, and again the annual weed load here is really heavy, kept swamping these things. So we had to set up these systems where we grew these grasses in this weed-free environment. But what it's enabled us to do, and you can see, well, that's poa there, we've cut that back, we get great crops off that poa. The Cymbopogon over there, again, that's the biggest stand of barbed wire grass that I've found, around here. We've got Ostradanthonia over there. Again, would have been a really big component of open grassy woodland. It always is. But up here, it's always a tiny little dribs and drabs around edges because it's very dark. So again, we're starting to build up our supplies of that. The Caplopedium, Same sort of deal. We've got the thermiter here where we did originally have enough seed to sow it into the ground. So those thermiter crops have done quite well, and as Sam said, we got more off those than we managed to find anywhere in the actual landscape. We've got 3 hectares down there that we've actually just sown into 5 grasses. So it'll be thermiter and Caplopedium, Poa, Microlina, I think Bophiocloa. So we're growing those at much bigger scale, because we need a lot more of those, and we're just about to start building the pad and a shed. So we're actually building some infrastructure to now be able to process this seed for ourselves. It's taken me 20 years to build this. I desperately wanted to build this sort of thing in Victoria and never got around to it. We built little ones that got pulled apart at the end of projects.